Joan Mitchell loved the New York Studio School. She loved that it was an outpost for real painting. And she approved of its focus on ambition for the work, not for the career. Back in the 70s, when Mitchell was living in France and the New York Studio School had a summer program in Paris, the students would come out to Joan's studio in Veyteuil, where we see her here, often with their teacher, Elaine de Kooning. And then in March 1988, almost exactly 24 years ago to this day, Joan stood presumably on this platform, and she delivered a lecture, a Q&A really. Be serious painters, be visual painters, she told her audience. You have problems, you have people to support. Okay, who doesn't? But paint, paint. During that visit, and during her many visits to New York in the 70s and the 80s, Joan would inevitably make the rounds of artist studios. So these would be studios of friends, studios of friends of friends, some of them students here. One painter told me about remembering Joan appearing for the first time in her studio looking glamorous and tough in sunglasses and a long fur coat. Others remember Joan hobbling around on a cane. This was after having had 2 hip replacements, looking tired and rail thin, but always ready to talk painting. So put yourself in your studio, nervously greeting Joan Mitchell. If your painting area is a mess, she'll right away give you hell. A studio has to be set up to eliminate distractions. You have to target the work in progress. So if you then would escape that harangue, she might just line your paintings up in a particular order and tell you to look. Or she might talk to you about the gestalt of a work in progress. Not that you shouldn't be aware of individual areas, but that you had to shift your focus to the overall configuration. Or she might speak about painting as a way of feeling living, which is not to say that painters shouldn't be aware of what they're doing. Never paint in a trance, she would order you. If you're not alert to where you're going, then you're just cleaning your brushes on canvas. And she'd be simultaneously wise and encouraging and caustic and brutal. If she liked you, she'd probably invite you to continue the conversation at some bar where she'd get you to drink way too many martinis. And if she really liked you, she might invite you to her home in Veyteuil. There she is. She might buy your plane ticket for you. She'd probably give you art supplies, maybe tell you you could paint in the old cistern on her property. And she might even purchase your work at ridiculously high prices and then hang it alongside a Franz Klein or something. And she would rivet her attention on you, drawing out your hopes and your fears, insisting that you had to crack that emotional shell, not be afraid. And you'd feel special. And, you know, the liquor would be flowing, and pretty soon you'd be telling her things that you hadn't really intended to tell any other human being. You'd be revealing your secrets. And then at a certain point, things would shift. And all of a sudden, Joan would be broadcasting your secrets. This was likely over dinner with maybe 6 or 8 people. Suddenly, you would be laid out for unmerciful public dissection on the grounds that there was really nothing to be ashamed of. and you would be stunned and hurt, and you'd probably desperately want out of there. Only Victoria is off the beaten track, and there are no hotels or easy trains back to Paris. Then later she'd probably seduce you again, and then abuse you, and then be incredibly kind, and then unspeakably rude. Along the way, she would forbid you to waste time wallowing in self-doubt. The important thing was to do one's work. Come on, man, get cracking, let's blow a pic. And if you were like most of Mitchell's protégés, you'd leave Victoria with important insights about yourself and your art. So for all of its connections with painting and young painters, Joan Mitchell was very fond of the New York studio school. And probably she was fond of it too because it was here in this building, here at 8 West 8th Street, that as a 24-year-old painter, she walked into the 1950 Whitney Annual and was stopped dead in her tracks by Willem de Kooning's attic. This was the first time she had ever seen de Kooning's work. Transformative moment. So we will catch up with her there in just a minute. First, I want to backtrack briefly and tell you that Joan Mitchell was born in 1925, born and raised in Chicago. She was the younger daughter of a wealthy, ambitious, and accomplished family. Her maternal grandfather was an engineer who built bridges and was also involved in the construction of some of the earliest steel frame skyscrapers. So his engineering drawings, which Joan kept with her all her life, were very important to her for their rigorous construction. Her mother was a lyric poet who instilled in Joan a lifelong love of poetry. Poetry was the art form that Mitchell considered most analogous to her own. She wanted for her art, she said, the feeling in a line of poetry that makes it different from a line of prose. Meaning, I think, in part, that what she was trying to say was inseparable from the way in which she was saying it. As for her father, he was a dermatologist, amateur artist, and a stern taskmaster who ordered his daughter to earn top grades, bring home sports trophies, and create accomplished works of art. And she did. Her childhood nickname was Bullet Head, and it fit. But her father also told her that because she was a girl, she would always be second-rate. When she was 12, he ordered her to choose her life's work. She chose artist and made art almost single-mindedly for the next 55 years. Although when she was in high school, she was also a nationally ranked figure skater. After she graduated, she attended Smith College for 2 years, and then she transferred to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she studied anatomy, art history, and life drawing, which was the core of that school's curriculum. So she was a brash yet compassionate young woman, and at this point a new member of the Communist Party. Toyed with socially concerned art as a student. In fact, much of her personal work during this student period, consisted of melancholic and poetic depictions of working men, beggars, and waifs, inspired by Picasso's paintings of the Blue Period, like Old Guitarist, and by the stark and dramatic prints of the German artist Kathy Kollwitz, who dignified the suffering of the powerless and the poor. So Joan admired Kollwitz for her draftsmanship, and she also saw her as a kind of role model. You know, here was a wealthy artist who was nonetheless committed to social justice and who commanded respect as a champion of the people. Summers of 1945 and 1946, Joan spent in Mexico. 1946, she was living in an apartment in Guanajuato with a view of La Bufa, the mountain that she considered her Mont Saint-Victoire. So she knew Cézanne's work also from the Art Institute. And she admired the aliveness and rigor of his landscapes and the way he addressed his shifting perceptions of the world as he moved through it. In La Bufa, and I just have a black and white of that, I don't have a color image. La Bufa, Mitchell, like Cézanne, conceives of her painting in terms of angled planes, sets up linear continuities among objects at various distances, and bisects the image, playing off rupture and continuity, and anticipating the many diptychs she would do later in her career. After graduating in 1947, Mitchell spent 13 months on a fellowship in France, where she painted intensely, yet she was as uncertain about her subject matter as she was about her more or less post-Cubist style. 1949, she moved to New York, and one of her first paintings here was Figure and the City, which is probably a self-portrait, and in any case, such a failure, she felt, that even as she was working on it, she knew she would never again paint the human figure. It was then that she walked into the Whitney Annual, and she was stunned by de Kooning's attic. I have to say that the colors here, all the images are a little bit off. Apologize for that, but the best we can do. So walked into the Whitney Annual, saw this painting here on the left by de Kooning, and was stunned, first of all, because de Kooning's raw, muscular, anxiety-filled canvas, in which nothing is taken for granted, gave her permission to shed the vestiges of an academic manner. So this look of freedom and immediacy that she was seeking didn't happen overnight, but she began moving in that direction. It also gave her permission to acknowledge paint as material substance and to begin to exploit its intrinsic qualities. She responded to de Kooning's leaps of space, his interlocking forms, and his unstable figure-ground relationships. As she was working on Crosssection of a Bridge, which was her first important New York painting, she jotted down a list, almost a poem, that suggests her new ideas about space. Toward blue, of red, glass, landscape, edge up, outlet, march, approach to water, bridge. Finally, de Kooning opened for her the myriad possibilities of abstraction. So bridges had long been a favorite subject, thanks to her engineer grandfather, but what her earlier bridge images had missed and abstraction could accommodate, she now realized, were her feelings about bridges. So cross-section of a bridge, salvages a la de Kooning, glimpses of the material world. So you can see there's a patch of water, reflections, cables, abutments, and so forth. But at the same time evokes the sensation of being near this flux of water and light in the underbelly of an urban bridge. '40s and 1950s the conventional wisdom held that women couldn't really paint the way men could. You know, it was a kind of biological thing. And in any case, men had families to support, so they should get preferential treatment. Joan loved to tell the story about how the very first time she took her work to a New York dealer, and this was back at the end of 1949, she was told, "Gee, Joan, if only you were French and male and dead." So for women, the game seemed lost in advance. Okay, Joan reasoned. So if things are really tough for women, then women have to be really tough. Making common cause with other women seemed pointless. Men were in charge, so Joan decided she was going to be one of the boys. So she's going to drink and swear and have affairs and paint with the best of them. She claimed that men always helped her more than did women, although she was also aware of the fact that since women by definition couldn't be major players, men had nothing to lose. So by 1954 then, when she was doing works like this one, so these kind of very restrained abstracts invoking feelings about weather and urban space, Joan had long since been hanging around the Cedar Bar. She had become a member of the Artists Club. She'd befriended de Kooning, Franz Klein, the poet Frank O'Hara, many others. She had also participated in the landmark 9th Street show. She'd had 2 solo shows in New York, and she was a regular at the important Stable Annual. And yet she wasn't living up to her own standards. So 1954 was a year of crisis, both personal and professional. She told her then boyfriend, the painter Michael Goldberg, that she'd put all her nickels in the slot machine and nothing was paying off. She wanted, quote, painting as cathedral, and yet her cathedral remained far distant. She also lamented to Goldberg that, quote, it's not much fun being nuts. What did she mean? Well, as far back as kindergarten, Joan had been aware that she perceived the world differently than most people. So in kindergarten one day, the kindergarten teacher had talked about the red A on the alphabet chart. And Joan stood up and said, no, it isn't red, it's green. And so the other kids gave her that, you're so weird look. And so she sat down and clammed up. In other words, she had synesthesia. Now, I'm sure many of you know, for those who don't, synesthesia is an innate, lifelong, involuntary condition in which when one of the 5 senses is stimulated, that sense responds and another one does too. So some synesthetes, for example, see sounds. Others hear flavors. Still others taste shapes. In certain forms of synesthesia, things like letters, numbers, or personalities trigger colors, flavors, or shapes. Joan Mitchell had at least 4 forms of synesthesia. First, she had colored letters, meaning that she saw the letters of the alphabet in colors. So, for example, her A was always this kind of fern green. But as she points out, if you can read that, this chart that she made at one point doesn't really convey the effect. For one thing, the colors of synesthesia are the colors of light, not the colors of pigment. And also, as she says up there, of course, in certain words, some letters merge or run, as into water or terp. The grays, metallic silver, cold blue, I can't get with these crayons, and so forth. Perhaps I should use oil paint. So she also had colored sounds, meaning that she saw sounds, music included, as abstract colored shapes moving as if on a screen in front of her. And these were shapes then that would consistently vary with pitch, timbre, and volume. So colored letters, colored sounds, these are two very common forms of synesthesia. In addition, she had two rare forms. She had colored personalities and colored emotions. So for her, hope was literally yellow. It wasn't that hope made her think of yellow, it was that yellow was what hope was. Loneliness was dark green and clingy, and depression was silvery white. Absolute horror, she said, just horror. In addition, Joan Mitchell had eidetic memory, which is anecdotally related to synesthesia, although the research is still sketchy. But what that meant for her was that she stored important memories in what she called her mental suitcase or her mental album of photographs. She said, I carry my landscapes with me. And she was able then to call up these certain memories in their sensory and emotional fullness, in effect to relive them. Such perceptions, said Mitchell, were very, very present for her. Yet apparently she never knew that synesthesia is a named, normal, and shared condition, which is now known to affect about 5% of the population. So synesthesia had been known and studied as far back as the early 19th century, but for much of the 20th century it kind of fell by the wayside. And it wasn't until 1993, the year after Joan Mitchell's death, that the publication of a book titled The Man Who Tasted Shapes brought it back to wide scientific and public attention. So today, then, neuroscientists can test for synesthesia. So they use, among other techniques, functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, which measures local oxygenation, an indirect sign of neural activity. And meanwhile, the debate continues over conceptual models for synesthesia, and research seems very promising. It promises not only a better understanding of synesthesia itself, but also of brain development, of the links between emotion and reason, and perhaps the very nature of consciousness. So Mitchell's crisis of 1954 was severe enough that she made a half-hearted attempt at suicide. By 1955, however, she had fought some hard-won battles with herself, and she had been able to turn a negative into a positive by now intentionally using her synesthetic perceptions in her art. So she started drawing upon these visual memories, memories of particular trees, fields, rivers, lakes, and so forth at particular moments. Color, sound, her feelings about landscape, the flow of consciousness, and paint itself became congruent. So Hudson River Dayline, for instance, and again the colors are a little off. Hudson River Dayline, as you can see, it appears, kind of coalesces at the center of the canvas as if it were on the artist's plane of consciousness, and it uses this newly distilled, exuberant, luminous color. If a painting was successful, and Joan Mitchell felt that Hudson River Dayline was, Then she said, motion is made still like a fish trapped in ice. It's trapped in the painting. My mind is like an album of photographs and paintings. I do not conceive. So synesthetes sometimes speak of catharsis and vindication when they learn that others share their condition. One synesthete has compared the moment when she found out that this was a known thing to the moment when the blind and deaf Helen Keller got the connection between W-A-T-E-R and that stream of cool water that was running over her hand. Joan never had that kind of experience. Moreover, when she talked about her unusual percepts, people assumed that she was speaking metaphorically or that she was revealing an overly vivid imagination. So she turned to writers like Rilke and Proust and to artists like Van Gogh and Kandinsky, who seemed to validate her ways of perceiving the world. And she turned to her own art. So at one level, she was implacably lonely. Now, I hasten to add that to say that Mitchell used her synesthesia in her art is not to say that she's illustrating her synesthetic perceptions or to imply that her neurology explains her art. She was a very complex artist, and she used every tool that she had at her disposal, including her synesthesia. So if you have very precisely colored feelings, for example, that's a great tool, but it's still a tool. You still have to make skilled use of it. So the point is that to reduce her to a case would be to disregard her visual intelligence, her deep knowledge of art history, and her eventual creation of a distinct visual language. Moreover, synesthetes can either focus on their synesthetic perceptions or they can tune them out the way we tune out distracting conversations. So David Hockney, who's another sound color synesthete, one who's been tested for synesthesia using fMRI, has said that he has chosen to use his synesthesia only in creating his opera sets. So Mitchell, in contrast, did use her synesthesia extensively, but the point is that she too had choices. Among Mitchell's works of the mid-50s is Hemlock, that she did in Canada, 1956. So it's a work that is no doubt indebted to Mondrian's early tree paintings, which she admired for their complex networks of lines and their compressed architecture of space. Like Mondrian, Mitchell subverts the traditional relationships between figure and ground. You do it one way, she'd say, and then deny it. Unlike Mondrian, she never allows her floating scaffolding to come together as a tree. Mitchell often read poetry in her studio as a way of shedding her ego and sort of intensifying her emotions as she was about to paint. Did she read poetry as she was working on Hemlock? Well, who knows? But she did reveal that she took the title from Wallace Stevens' poem, Domination of Black. So it's from a line that reads, "Yes, but the color of the heavy hemlocks." So hemlock felt right, according to Mitchell, because of its dark and blue feeling. How did she use her colored feelings or her sound-colored synesthesia? Again, we don't know. Though in 1957, she told the then critic Irving Sandler, and I quote from his notes, "I get images from words. Wallace Stevens, Domination of Black." In any case, it's interesting to note that the poem's atmosphere of fear and isolation as embodied by these dark, tall, menacing hemlocks are for Joan Mitchell the very qualities of white and dark green. And also that her painting, like Stephen's poem, mingles outer and inner worlds. So Mitchell denied any interest at all in self-expression. You know, she would say, this is painting about landscape. It comes from landscape. It's about landscape. It's nothing to do. It's not about me. But at the same time, she said it was about memories of her feelings. So memories of landscape, memories of feeling. You know, for Mitchell, they were almost one and the same. In 1959, she moved to Paris, and there she began doing these panoramic paintings like the 6 by 10 foot Grand Carrière, which is today in the collection of the New York Museum of Modern Art. So it's a large scale, kind of disrupted syntax. So Mitchell's works then from this period, the early 60s, I think very easily surpassed the viewer's ability to process them in a conscious way. Moreover, they shuttle between European pastoralism and New York swagger. So the paint is swiped, it's dripped, it's dry brushed, it's slathered, it's applied with many different kinds of brushes. It's put on with fingers. You can see over there in the bottom right-hand corner. Fingers, rags, sometimes even just stuck on like a wad of gum. There are lines like live wires and areas like fine mist. For all of its incident and variety, her work remained carefully structured. So the stereotype of the abstract expressionist painter, of course, is that she just threw her feelings on canvas. Yes, Mitchell did paint like the athlete she once was, this kind of whole body manner of applying the paint. She did take advantage of accidents. She did make decisions as she went along. But she was always working from a mental image, from this very carefully structured plan for her picture, whose evolution she would stop and ponder from the other end of her studio after every few strokes. I stop, look, and listen at railroad tracks, as she put it. I really want to be accurate. So for this kind of accuracy, she looked, among others, to Bach, whose music she played obsessively in the early 60s. Like Bach, she was seeking something abstract and yet emotionally precise. "1962 saw the emergence of pop art, movement for which Mitchell had little but scorn. She characterized it as all money and no cathedral. Paintings of the early 60s, it's almost as if they, embattled Joan Mitchell as, saying, take that pop art, take that. This is what real painting looks like. And then in 1967, she purchased the property in Veyteuil. So it was a large property up on a hill overlooking the Seine. And it included a small house where the Impressionist Claude Monet had lived between 1878 and 1881. The neuroscientist Richard Cytowic, among others, has written about synesthete's typically ecstatic response to nature. And nowhere, I think, is this more evident than in Joan Mitchell's paintings of the late 60s and early 70s. So paintings like My Landscape 2, an image poem in which water is paint and paint is water, and hills and fields lapse into lines and shapes, colors and light, then reassert themselves as landscape, experienced at a moment of intense an unnameable revelation. "I want to drink the landscape," Mitchell once said of Vautour. So, this from an alcoholic. Throughout her career, Mitchell looked and learned from everyone, and she did a lot of savvy borrowing. From Matisse, for instance, whose work she had known and emulated since college, she learned how to create visual equivalents for her emotional involvement with particular landscapes, using what she thought of as his very felt line, and also leaving bits of unpainted canvas among her forms to create a kind of, again, felt sensation of light. From her friend Sam Francis, whom she had met in Paris in the mid-50s, and whose work had gained new meaning for her since the move to Vautour, she learned about escaping gravity, about opening space to admit white, and about transubstantiating pigment into light, both artists belonging to what the curator Marcia Tucker once called an expressive tradition that includes radiance as an image of revelation. In Vautour, Joan also had a large, beautiful garden where she grew vegetables and flowers, especially her beloved sunflowers. So sunflowers were something she intensely felt, and so sunflower feelings now become a favorite subject. Whether young or mature, sprouting or dying, sunflowers often brought her this sensation of psychic merging. "I become the sunflower, the lake, the tree," she said. "I no longer exist." So back in the early 50s, she had tried to deal with and overcome such feelings through psychoanalysis. Now she's embraced them and uses them in her art. So around the same time that Mitchell discovered the work of a Berkeley psychologist by the name of Anton Eisenzweig, whose 1967 book, The Hidden Order of Art, became one of her Bibles. This is one she often instructed her young protégés to read. So Eisenzweig argues that the creative thinker must engage with the seeming chaos of the unconscious, from which a complex order will eventually emerge. And he also writes that the creative act causes the ego to oscillate between one level and another, including the oceanic level, where we feel our individual existence lost in mystic union with the universe. So it's not surprising that Mitchell's response to Vautour was on the order of Van Gogh's to Arles. Two of them experienced color, light, landscape with equal intensity. And for both artists, painting was a means of salvation from this sort of avalanche of stimuli that they had to deal with. It was also a kind of salvation from their own aggression. Mitchell deeply admired Van Gogh. She called him, that perfection, and felt that his work epitomized the synthesis of accuracy and intensity to which she aspired. And she learned lots of things from Van Gogh, how to set up complementary, near complementary colors for the kind of dynamic pull, how to use bold yet lyrical dabs, stabs and swirls of paint, bodying forth energy and growth, but at the same time manifesting paint as paint, or in this case on the right, pastel as pastel. And also learning how to impassion nature and objects. This last phrase, a quote from an essay on Van Gogh by Antonin Artaud. This was a another work that Mitchell greatly admired. And here then is an excellent example of that kind of impassioning in Mitchell's own work. So 1972, Blue Territory, a work that seems to respond to the late winter landscape around her home in Vétheuil, and also perhaps draws heavily upon her mental album. So what we see here is a kind of snow flurried plain as if at twilight. We see a glaze of yellow there at the bottom, glazed with green. We see a fallow field. It's kind of frosted with lavender, like a Monet snow effect. And at the upper right, we see this purified, star-spangled ultramarine, reminiscent of Van Gogh's Starry Night, a painting that had long obsessed her. Blue plays an important role in many of Mitchell's works from the 70s, partly because of the qualities of weather and light in the Valley of the Seine. According to the artist, the blue in her paintings is the Seine. It's Lake Michigan, too. It's rather the feeling I have for these things. Every Mitchell painting, she said, began with the Lake Michigan of her Chicago childhood. So like Eidetic Memory, painting for her collapsed time and space. It escaped terminations, sadness, and death. Thus, she began doing paintings that function for her, among other things, as physical and emotional sanctuaries for herself and her loved ones, whether human or canine. Should explain that Joan was a great lover of dogs. She had many dogs over the course of a lifetime. At this point, she had 3 rather nippy German shepherds. So a number of paintings, she did for dogs, and always again taking this idea of sanctuary very literally, mapping out each of these territory paintings and choosing the colors specifically for the person or the dog that she had in mind. In the case of Blue Territory, we don't know who that was. I mentioned Monet, to whose work Mitchell's is often compared. Mitchell both loved and hated Monet, but mostly she publicly scorned him. She called him Monet. And she accused him of being a mediocre colorist and also of not properly tipping the plane forward in his landscapes. Probably she felt that if she were perceived as being influenced by Monet, people would think that this once tough New York school painter had succumbed to the temptation of life is beautiful, abstract impressionism. And it's true the two were up to fundamentally different things, with Monet painting in plein air, trying to capture these shifting atmospheric effects. Mitchell, on the other hand, painting in her studio, usually at night, to evoke memories of her feelings about particular places that she'd experienced in the past. And yet, there are so many points of visual reference between the late Monet and the late Mitchell. So the two were, of course, responding to the same landscape. Giverny is just down the road from Vétheuil. But also, both often work the edges of abstraction, both weave colors together, both mingle water, land, and sky, both use light in uncanny ways. And the truth is that Mitchell, again, learned from everyone, including Monet. In 1985, Mitchell painted Faded Air 1, a painting in precarious balance, in which the spiky scrawl of pigment on the left pitches diagonally toward the rising tower of Scribbles on the right. She painted Faded Air 1 in a state of despair, having recently been diagnosed with cancer of the jaw. Its emotional trigger, she said, was, quote, the tragic and beautiful sunflowers dying in autumn, and the fall cool sun, that cold yellow, superb. She also brings in here cobalt green on the right there, this unusual semi-transparent sort of bluish green verging on gray that at this point became one of her fetish colors, and a very unhappy color, she said. She also took inspiration for this painting, she told a friend, from Bach's Cantata 78, the way that it mounts, fabulous. So by now, Mitchell had been forging ahead for some 3 decades, saddled all the while with the somewhat disparaging label, second-generation abstract expressionist. In the 60s and the 70s, she'd had relatively few shows. 70s painting had supposedly died, and in any case, gestural abstraction was hopelessly old-fashioned, and lack of irony equally so. So the crowd had moved off in a different direction. Mitchell was often seeing only her own footprints in the snow. If by the 80s painting was back and she had a dynamic New York dealer, nonetheless, she continued to set her own rules and to find myriad ways of following them, meeting them. So while she was staying true to this path that she'd set in the 50s, her art continued to evolve, and for her, painting was far from exhausted. In fact, by the mid-80s, her growing awareness of mortality had made it even more urgently important. In 1986, Joan and her dealer, Xavier Fourcade, who was dying of AIDS, made an excursion from Vétheuil to Lille in northern France to see an exhibition of work by Henri Matisse. This was work from 2 Russian collections. And among the works then in that show was this one that had been commissioned by a Russian collector for his Moscow home. 13 feet wide, large painting. One that Mitchell had actually seen about 16 years earlier at a Matisse retrospective in Paris, from which she had emerged weeping with emotion. What spoke to her, I'm sure many things in the La Danse, but color for one. For another, the painting's kinetic quality, this kind of buoyant circularity, the fact that it's simultaneously moving and still. Upon her return to Vétheuil, she created the Leela suite of paintings in her now preferred format of diptychs consisting of 2 vertical panels. So here we've got 9 feet high, 13 feet across, so 9 by 13. So it's a format that she liked for lots of reasons, among other things because it allows her to play off circularity and rectangularity, play off that kinds of organic form she uses with that vertical cut, unity and interruption. It's a painting that I think is opulent and tough, structured and free, moving and still. So here then is that fish trapped in ice. So clearly it's indebted to Matisse's La Danse, but perhaps it's also indebted to the Cathedral of Beauvais, where Mitchell and Fourcade had stopped en route to Lille. So Joan Mitchell had always been an enthusiastic visitor to cathedrals. And in fact, she had in her possession an invitation from the French Ministry of Culture to do a stained glass window for the Cathedral of Nevers in central France. Eventually she accepted, but unfortunately that never happened, probably because of her illness. She loved Beauvais, which she once called that crazy late Gothic, unfinished, superb, nutty monument to God. So unfinished referring to the fact that the vaults collapsed in the 13th century and were never completely rebuilt. Painting as cathedral was also a favorite Joan Mitchell metaphor, one that she used in her personal letters and conversations as early as the 1950s, and which shows up again, for instance, in a text which her companion and housemate, the composer Giselle Barrault, wrote about Mitchell's 83-84 Grand Valais suite, a group of paintings ignited, in Barrault's words, into sonorous, luminous, radiating cathedrals. Now, Joan Mitchell could be very quick to bring things down to earth. What happens when you paint? An interviewer once asked her. Nothing, she characteristically answered. My hands get awful dirty. She was not a religious person. In fact, she was an atheist. She unflinchingly acknowledged our aloneness in the cosmos. Dead is dead. As Dave Hickey has pointed out, Mitchell's dying sunflowers don't swoon or wilt. They decay into weeds and sticks. In what sense, then, was she seeking painting as cathedral? Well, a cathedral, of course, consists of stone and glass, structure and light, which could be seen as analogous to Mitchell's quest for accuracy and intensity. A cathedral is a place, a sanctuary, as painting was for her. And a cathedral is both a material and a spiritual program. Mitchell told another interviewer that spirituality is a hokey word. Yet she went on to bemoan the fact that painting had lost some of its spirituality, which is what it had once been about. Another key book for Joan Mitchell was Hugo von Hofmannsthal's fictional Lord Chandos letter, in which a certain Lord Chandos renounces writing because words have become painfully inadequate. At the same time, he's realized that, quote, a watering can, a harrow left standing in a field, a dog in the sun, a rundown churchyard, any of these can become the vessel for my revelation. He continues, once again, words desert me, for it is indeed something entirely unnamed, even barely nameable, which at such moments reveals itself to me, filling like a vessel any casual object of my daily surroundings with an overflowing flood of higher life. Such was Joan Mitchell's experience. It's true that her sunflowers decay into weeds and sticks, but not until she has fully felt their living and their dying. Not until something entirely unnamed, even barely nameable, has filled them like a vessel with an overflowing flood of higher life. So fully, in fact, as to cause her to lose her own sense of selfhood. I become the sunflower, she said. Mitchell's own cathedral, her higher life, had nothing to do with the great beyond or with the ultimate meaning of life or death, but rather with an intensified aliveness, here and now, as suggested by the title EC, Here, of one of her very last paintings, done as she was dying of cancer. A cathedral requires both powerful feelings, religious feelings in the case of a Beauvais, and the desire and ability to give them material expression worthy of their significance. A stone is a stone until it becomes part of a cathedral, and then it's also something more. Similarly, EC springs from Mitchell's vivid awareness of the particulars of this world, which achieve their full expression, their presence, through abstract painting. In EC, paint is emphatically paint, yet it also becomes something more. The thing expressed is essentially the unexpressible. As for Mitchell's synesthesia, because synesthesia is relatively rare, it's sometimes assumed to be a higher state of consciousness. Yet to live with it every day is to take it for granted, the way we take left or right-handedness for granted. So I don't mean to suggest that Mitchell somehow lived in a re-enchanted world, only that hers was a visually and emotionally intense life experience, rife with both pleasure and pain, and that she was wise and courageous enough to privilege that experience in her art. She believed only in painting. Like music, she said, painting is beyond life and death. It is another dimension. Thank you.